The posting came through on a Tuesday, which I remember only because Tuesday was the day the commissary at Havenout restocked the decent coffee, and I'd been sitting there with a mug of something that tasted like boiled insulation when my handheld buzzed with the assignment details. I read them twice. Then I finished the coffee anyway, because there was nothing in the assignment details that would have tasted better than bad coffee, and at 54 years old I had learned to finish what was in front of me before dealing with what was coming. Calvin's Reach Cargo and Beast Depot, interim holding handler, duration, open-ended minimum 6 months, compensation, standard contract rate, accommodations, on-site staff quarters shared. Below that, a single addendum line in the clipped font, the Alliance used for things it didn't want to draw attention to. Facility currently warehousing 3 juvenile Dreth, pre-transfer pending certification of receiving facility. Handler familiarity with large predatory species preferred but not required. I had spent 19 years in frontier combat training. I had handled 3 kinds of armored reptilians, 2 breeds of pack predators, and 1 experiment in weaponized bear analogs that I would not discuss under any circumstances. I was not the right person for this job, in the sense that the Alliance imagined I was the right person for this job. They were thinking of my credentials, which were extensive. They were not thinking about why those credentials had gone unused for 2 years, or why I had been sitting in Havenout's commissary drinking bad coffee on a Tuesday, instead of running a certification program somewhere with a budget. That was fine. I was used to being the thing people brought in without thinking too hard about the details. I signed the contract, finished my coffee, and started packing. Calvin's Reach was 4 transit jumps from anything a person would voluntarily visit. It sat at the edge of a trade corridor that had been important about 30 years ago, and had since been replaced by a better route 3 systems over, leaving the station stranded in a kind of commercial amber, still technically operational, still receiving cargo manifests, still maintaining its Alliance certification through paperwork inertia rather than genuine activity. The depot itself was the largest structure on the station, a long, low building of corrugated composite panels and poured-form structural columns, surrounded by a perimeter of weathered post fencing, and beyond that, a stretch of flat compacted ground that had once been a livestock staging area and was now mostly dust and the occasional wind-driven piece of packing material. The staff quarters were 2 converted cargo containers set end-to-end, with a shared kitchen unit and 4 bunks in varying states of mattress quality. My predecessor had left a collection of small printed cards on the counter, each one bearing a species-specific warning about the juvenile Dreth in the pen attached to the south side of the building. The cards were laminated. Someone had taken their warning responsibilities very seriously. Dreth, juvenile, pre-adult, approach only with Class C barrier gear. Do not make sustained eye contact. Do not enter the enclosure during feeding periods. Do not enter the enclosure alone. Do not touch the dorsal ridge crests. Do not approach the pack matron without Alliance-certified behavioral observer present. I read through the cards. I turned one over. The back was blank. I put them in the drawer under the counter. The Alliance behavioral observer was already on site when I arrived. One Pierre Adden, 28 years old, recently posted from an Alliance xenobiology program on Verath Station, currently holding a data pad in both hands and looking at me the way recent graduates look at people who did not graduate recently, which is to say with a combination of respect and the quiet conviction that their methodologies were more current. He showed me the intake documentation on the Dreth, which was thorough, and then showed me the observation logs, which were also thorough, and then summarized the behavioral profile of each juvenile in a systematic manner that told me everything about what the data said and nothing about what the animals were actually like. I listened to all of it. I asked 2 questions: how long since they'd had their last transit, and who had been feeding them, and from the answers gathered that the animals had been in the depot hold for 11 weeks, had been handled primarily by remote arm feeders because my predecessor had not been comfortable entering the enclosure, and were showing what Pierre Adden described as heightened environmental vigilance and social cohesion stress indicators, which meant they were bored, unsettled, and sticking together because nothing in the environment made sense to them. I asked Pierre where the pen was. He took me around the south end of the building. The enclosure was about 30 meters on a side. The perimeter fence, a double run of high-tensile composite sheeting anchored into poured footings, with a mesh observation panel in the fence facing north, and a heavy-duty double gate at the east end for entry. Inside the fence there was a concrete-floored section near the gate, the original pen design, built for standard livestock, and beyond that a stretch of the original compacted earth that had been included when the fence was extended out, giving the animals more space. There was a low shelter roof at the far west end, open on 3 sides, where the Dreth spent most of their time according to Pierre's notes. The 3 juveniles were there when I walked up to the observation panel. They were approximately the size of a large draft animal, not full Dreth size, which ran to the scale of small buildings, but in the range where you took them seriously as physical facts. Their scales were the copper green of old oxidized metal, matte finished, overlapping in a pattern that got tighter and more armored along the ridge spine and flanks. Their heads were wedge-shaped, broader at the jaw, with amber eyes set forward in the skull for predator binocular vision, and along the dorsal ridge from neck to mid-back, there was a crest of interlocking plates that could raise and flatten depending on arousal state. 6 limbs, 4 primary load-bearing, 2 anterior that functioned as a combination of foreleg and manipulative limb when the animal was still. Clawed. Everything about them was clawed. All 3 were watching me. Their crests were neither fully raised nor fully flat, which I recognized as the neutral alert state, taking stock of the new variable. Behind them, settled against the far fence, was the pack matron. Pierre had mentioned her in the intake documents, but I hadn't focused on the details. She was a full adult Dreth, old by the look of the scarring on her left orbital plate and the worn-down tips of her foremost claws. One of her amber eyes had clouded to a milky gray. The alliance had kept her with the juveniles because Dreth cubs transported without a bonded adult showed extreme behavioral dysregulation. They needed an elder to anchor to. She was too old and too scarred for training deployment. Her role was purely social. Her name in the intake docs was Depot Adult Female 1, which was the kind of designation that told you everything about who had written the intake docs. I called her Sunken Eye for the clouded eye in my head, not to anyone else. I stood at the observation panel for about 10 minutes. The 3 juveniles watched me. They did not approach and they did not retreat. Sunken Eye watched me too, from the far end of the pen, without moving. Then I went inside, found the camp stove in the staff quarters gear locker, and made a field ration breakfast. Dried protein block, reconstituted grain, a cup of the instant coffee that came in the supply kit, and which was considerably worse than the commissary coffee at Having Out. I put it all in a metal bowl and a metal cup, the kind that have been standard equipment in frontier operations for 40 years, because nothing has been invented that is more practical for the same cost, and I carried them out to the pen, unlatched the east gate, walked through it, latched it behind me, and sat down on the compacted earth in the middle of the open section, cross-legged, and ate breakfast. Pierre Adden, who had been filling out observation logs at the fold-down desk in the observation section, appeared at the mesh panel approximately 90 seconds after I entered the enclosure. His face had an expression on it that I recognized as someone who had memorized a set of protocols that were being comprehensively ignored. He did not say anything, because the 3 juvenile Dreth had stood up. Not in an aggressive way. In the way animals stand when they encounter a novel stimulus that requires more attention than the sitting position allows. Their crests rose slightly. Their anterior limbs shifted their weight forward. They stood and they looked at me, sitting cross-legged on the dirt eating a field ration, and then the smallest of the three, the one I would come to call Kale, though that designation also was only in my head for the first several weeks, took 2 steps toward me and stopped. I ate my breakfast. I didn't look at them directly, which was standard predatory species practice, but I also didn't look away in the exaggerated manner that communicates anxiety. I looked at the middle distance, which happened to be a stretch of fence near the south wall. I drank my coffee. When I finished, I set the bowl and cup on the ground beside me, because the compacted earth was flat enough for that, and I sat there for another 10 minutes doing nothing. Nothing happened, in the most significant possible sense of that phrase. Kale, after those initial 2 steps, had stopped and then sat back down, not retreating, just settling. The other 2, whom I would later call Veth and Oreth, remained standing but lowered their crests to the neutral position. Sunk and I had not moved from the far end of the pen. I got up after the 10 minutes, picked up my bowl and cup, walked back to the gate, let myself out, and went inside to write up the entry log. Pierre Adden appeared in the doorway of the staff quarters approximately 4 minutes after that. He was still holding his data pad. He looked like he had several things to say and was working out the order. "You entered the enclosure without barrier gear," he said. "I know. The protocol. The protocol is a minimum safety standard for personnel unfamiliar with the animals. It's not a behavioral training methodology." I poured a second cup of the bad coffee. They didn't charge. They didn't display aggression. They stood up and looked at me, which is exactly what curious animals do when they see something new. If I'd gone in there in full Class C gear, clanking around and smelling like composite sealant, I would have confirmed that the new handler is another incomprehensible threat, which is what 11 weeks of remote arm feeders has already taught them. Pierre considered this. The intake documentation suggests direct contact before full behavioral assessment could result in. I didn't make direct contact. I ate breakfast. I sat down. Go write it up however you need to write it up. I'm not asking you to violate your reporting requirements. I'm telling you what I'm going to do so you're not surprised. He wrote it up. I could hear the stylus moving quickly. I ate breakfast in the pen every morning for the next 9 days. I varied nothing. The same camp stove, the same field ration components, the same metal bowl and cup, the same cross-legged position in the same patch of open earth, the same 10 minutes of sitting afterward. I did not attempt to interact with the juveniles. I did not call to them. I did not offer food. They had a separate feeding schedule that Pierre administered through the remote arm setup, which I kept running for the first 2 weeks to avoid disrupting their nutrition while I worked on everything else. What I worked on primarily was sitting there. On the 3rd morning, Kale came within 4 meters of me before sitting back down. On the 5th morning, Veth came with him, and they both sat at approximately 3 meters. On the 7th morning, Oreth, the largest of the 3, and the one with the most pronounced dorsal crest, which tended to stay slightly higher than the others as a baseline, came to within 5 meters, stopped, and remained standing for most of my breakfast before lowering to a crouch. Sunk and I watched all of this from the far end of the pen. On the 9th morning, she rose and walked to within about 8 meters of me, which was the closest she had come, and stood there for approximately 3 minutes before returning to the shelter overhang. I wrote up my own logs each evening. They were considerably shorter than Pierre's because I was mostly recording what the animals did and I did not have a theoretical framework that required extended notation. My notes from those first 9 days read, in summary, eating breakfast in enclosure, day 1 through 9, animals approaching, no aggression, pack matron observing. That was the whole of it. I did not have a plan beyond the next morning. This is probably the thing that people find hardest to understand when the later documentation gets discussed, which is that there was no training program. There was no behavioral modification methodology. There was no technique being applied. I was 54 years old. I had a bad knee from an incident in the second year of my frontier training career that had never been correctly repaired, and I was tired in the way you get tired not from a single event, but from the long, slow accumulation of events. And what I was doing in that pen every morning was eating my breakfast where it was quieter than the staff quarters, which it was. Because Pierre hadn't started his documentation work at 6 in the morning, and the pen was peaceful at 6 in the morning. In a way, the staff quarters were not. That was the entire theoretical basis of the methodology. On the 11th day, I dragged a folding camp chair into the pen. My knee had been bothering me for a week. The compacted earth was harder than it looked, and the cross-legged position was not kind to the joint. And I found the chair in the gear locker, one of the old tubular frame models with a canvas seat, and I brought it in with me along with the stove and bowl and cup, and set it up in my usual spot, and sat in it instead of on the ground. Lower profile than the ground sit, but with better support. Cale came to 2 meters that morning and stopped there. He crept the last meter very slowly, the way juveniles do when they're negotiating uncertainty, and then he sat at approximately 1 meter from the chair leg and watched me eat. His crest was at full neutral, not raised, not compressed. He smelled like warm stone and something faintly electric, which I knew from other reptilian species as a stress chemistry marker, but it was mild. It was curiosity stress rather than threat stress. I finished my breakfast. I put the bowl on the ground, as I always did. I sat in the chair for my 10 minutes. Cale spent those 10 minutes approximately 90 centimeters from my right boot, sitting in a crouch that I came to understand later was a rest position, weight settled back onto the haunches, anterior limbs loosely forward. Not alert crouch, rest crouch. He was sitting still because I was sitting still. I did not document this in an excited way. I wrote, Cale at 1 m during breakfast, rest crouch at 90 cm during post-meal sit, duration 10 min, no aggression. Crest neutral. What I did not write, because it was not the kind of thing that went in a log, was that it was a very good morning. Veth joined Cale within 4 days. Oreth took another week. The larger ones are often more cautious, which is counterintuitive but consistent. And by the end of the 3rd week, all 3 cubs were within 1.5 meters of the chair during the post-meal sit, in their rest crouch positions, and Sunk and I had moved to within 4 meters, and was doing something I can only describe as a relaxed observation posture. Weight settled, neck slightly lowered, one eye on me and one eye scanning the general pen perimeter the way experienced adults do when they've determined that the immediate situation doesn't require full attention. Pierre Adden had, by this point, stopped commenting on the barrier gear. He had started writing very long documentation entries instead. The thing that Pierre called ground calm, and this is where I should explain, because the nomming is the part that gets retold in the later accounts, and almost always gets retold wrong, was not something I named. I did not name any of this. I did not have a name for what I was doing because I was not doing anything in a deliberate enough way to require a name. What happened was this. Approximately 6 weeks in, Pierre was reviewing his observation footage from the previous 2 weeks and trying to produce a behavioral classification for what the cubs were doing during the post-meal sit period. He needed a notation label for the condition, the animal behavioral state that the cubs were reproducing consistently in my presence. He was cross-referencing it with established Dreth behavioral taxonomy, which documented a range of arousal and social states, and he could not find a match. What he was observing was not standard rest state. The cubs were not asleep. They were not in alert state. They were not in the cohesion display posture that pack species use for social reinforcement. They were in a state that Pierre described in his documentation as a novel relaxed vigilance condition characterized by lowered arousal, physical proximity to the handler, and apparent environmental trust signaling, and which he labeled provisionally as ground calm provisional, because the cubs first exhibited it on the ground before I started using the chair, and because the word calm described it adequately. He filed the notation in his behavioral log. He mentioned it to me in passing. I said, "All right," and poured a cup of coffee. What I did not know at the time, because I was not in regular contact with the Alliance Xenobiology Division, was that Pierre was submitting his observation logs as part of a broader multi-site study of juvenile Dreth behavioral development in non-optimal holding conditions. The study was designed to gather data from holding facilities like Calvin's Reach, the backwater depots, the interim postings, the places that were never going to produce publishable results under normal circumstances, and Pierre's logs, which were extremely thorough, were being read by people with considerably more institutional investment in Dreth behavioral science than either of us. By the time I found out about any of this, it had been 4 months. In those 4 months, the following things had happened, none of which I had planned. Kale had started sitting on my feet. This began around week 8, and I want to be precise about the mechanics because the later descriptions tend to romanticize it. He did not curl up on my feet the way a domestic companion animal might. He sat on them. He positioned his haunches on my boots in the rest crouch posture and settled his weight there, which was approximately the weight of a moderately loaded supply crate, and he stayed there for the duration of the post-meal sit. This was not comfortable. I did not say anything about it, because the behavioral principle of not communicating anxiety during a predator-social interaction still applied, and because the knee was going to hurt regardless of whether a juvenile Dreth was sitting on my feet. I made a note in the log: Kale physical contact, feet sitting, duration 10 min. Veth had started following me when I walked the perimeter. Part of my daily routine, which I had not initially thought of as part of any kind of behavioral program, was walking the inside of the pen fence once each evening to check the structural integrity of the composite sheeting, standard maintenance practice in any holding facility, and one that my predecessor had apparently conducted only from outside the enclosure. I walked it from inside because it was faster, and because the sheeting could not be properly inspected from outside due to the placement of the exterior bracing. On the 41st day, Veth got up and walked with me. Not beside me exactly. Behind me and to the left at about 2 meters, maintaining consistent spacing through the corners and the straight sections, stopping when I stopped, moving when I moved. I walked the full perimeter. Veth walked the full perimeter. I wrote it up and tried to explain to Pierre that I didn't think it was formation behavior in any sophisticated sense. I thought Veth was just following me the way animals follow anything that moves with calm, consistent purpose, and Pierre disagreed with this interpretation, respectfully but at length. Oreth had started what I can only describe as supervisory sitting during the stove setup. I used the same routine every morning. Set the stove on the ground to the left of the chair, light it, prepare the ration components, cook, eat, put out the stove, clean the bowl and cup with the canteen water and the small brush I kept in the kit bag. Oreth, by the 10th week, was sitting approximately 1 meter to my right during the stove setup, and watching the entire sequence of actions with the focused, still attention that reptilians use when they are learning something. Not every morning, frequently enough to be a pattern. His crest would lower to the compressed position during the setup, which I came to understand as intense focus rather than suppression. He was watching the sequence. I did not know what to do with this observation, so I continued doing what I was doing. And Sunkenai, the old clouded eye pack matron who had watched all of this from the far end of the pen for the first 6 weeks, had, by the end of month 4, moved her primary resting position to approximately 2 meters from the chair. She didn't engage with me directly. She didn't approach during breakfast. But her resting position had migrated from the shelter at the far end to a spot near the center of the open section, within comfortable visual range of the chair, and she faced outward from that position rather than inward, which any experienced handler will recognize as the adult sentinel posture. You watch the perimeter, not the thing you're guarding, because the thing you're guarding is fine. I had not done this, It had done itself. The thing I want to try to convey, because I think it gets lost in the documentation and the later institutional language, is what those months actually felt like from inside them. They did not feel significant. They felt like the slow, unremarkable accumulation of ordinary mornings. I woke up before the sunrise. I made bad coffee in the staff quarters. I carried the stove and kit out to the pen. I did the routine. I came back in. I wrote a log entry. I ate a second meal at midday, usually at the fold-down desk, and looked over the pen through the south-facing window while I ate, which was not a clinical observation. I just sat facing the window because the view was better than the view of the far wall, which had a motivational placard left by some previous posting that I had been meaning to take down since week 1, and had continued not taking down. The pen in the middle of the day was usually quiet. The cubs rested after feeding. Sunk and I rested. The light came down at a low angle across the compacted earth, and the copper green of the cubs' scales caught it differently at different hours, which was something I noticed without thinking about noticing, the way you notice the quality of light when you spend a lot of time in a place. I did not think I was doing anything. I thought I was passing time in a reasonable way while waiting for the transfer situation to resolve itself. What Pierre thought he was observing, I learned much later, was something he described in a message to his program supervisor at the end of month 3 as consistent, replicable positive behavioral change in all 3 juvenile subjects at a rate and completeness I cannot account for under the current literature. He had been submitting his logs faithfully, but by month 3 he had started adding attached notes that were less formal than the logs, more speculative, and considerably more animated. He showed me some of these later. In one of them he had written, "The handler does not appear to be aware that she is doing anything that requires explanation. This may itself be the relevant observation." I found this more flattering than I found most things that were written about the situation, because it was accurate. Pierre also started sleeping later, which I noticed because he was no longer at the documentation desk when I came back from the morning routine. He had been waking at 6 to start his logs, and I had interrupted this reliably by returning to the staff quarters at 6:30 smelling like the pen. In month 3, he started setting his alarm for 6:30, and in month 4 he stopped setting it entirely and just got up when the smell of the camp stove drifted in through the ventilation gap, which was a behavioral adaptation I did not document but thought about. There was one morning, sometime around week 14, that I want to put down because it was the morning I understood that the thing happening in the pen was no longer in the category of animal adapting to handler presence, and had crossed into something else. I was in the post-meal sit, chair, usual positions, usual quiet. Dreth had fallen asleep on my right, one of his sporadic naps, weight settled, the click-and settle of the dorsal plates flattening as he dropped into genuine sleep rather than the light rest crouch. Kale was on my feet. Dreth was to my left. From the far end of the pen there came a sound, a high, thin whistle from outside the fence, where the cargo platform on the east side of the station had a pressure release valve that occasionally triggered. It was not a large sound, but it was sharp and unfamiliar, and I watched the 3 cubs process it. Kale looked up, he looked at the fence, then he looked at me. I had not moved. I was not going to move over a pressure valve. Kale looked at the fence for another moment, and then he put his head back down on my feet. Dreth looked at the fence, looked at me, and adjusted his rest crouch position slightly, settling more weight back. Dreth did not wake up. Sunk and I had raised her crest at the initial sound, turned in the direction of the fence, held the raised position for approximately 4 seconds, and then lowered it again and resumed the outward perimeter watch. All of them had checked me before making any decision about the sound. Not as a trained response, they had not been trained to check me. They checked me because I was the fixed point, the stable feature of the world, the thing that would know if the pressure valve mattered. I thought about that for the rest of the morning. I thought about it while I wrote the log entry. I thought about it during lunch. Then I stopped thinking about it because thinking about it did not change what I was going to do the next morning, which was carry the stove out to the pen and make breakfast. Pierre filed a report at the 4-month mark. I read a copy of it later, considerably later, and it was a good report, careful and precise, documenting each of the behavioral developments I've described, and several others that Pierre had noted that I hadn't, including a change in the cub's response to environmental disturbances. The depot sat near a cargo approach path, and occasionally freighters would pass at low altitude, generating significant sound and vibration. In the first weeks, this had caused the cubs to cluster and display defensive cohesion posture. By month 4, during a low pass from a heavy cargo hauler, all 3 cubs had looked to me, maintained their positions, and after a brief pause resumed their resting postures. Pierre documented this as social reference behavior, the animals using the handler as an environmental stability anchor. I had been on a cargo approach path at the frontier post in the 4th year of my training career. I was not going to be startled by a freighter. The report went through Pierre's program supervisor at Dreth Station, and then into the broader study database, where it was apparently read with some interest by a Dr. Tesser of Hallen, who was the Alliance's senior specialist in Dreth behavioral development, and who had been trying for 9 years to document the conditions under which juvenile Dreth would form stable social bonds with non-Dreth handlers. The existing literature held that such bonds were theoretically possible, but had never been reliably produced in a depot or training context. The animals were too large, too unpredictable in novel environments, and the institutional protocols designed for handler safety were functionally incompatible with the low arousal, consistent presence that social bonding required. What Dr. Hallen read in Pierre's report was a description of all the things those protocols prevented. No armor, no sudden approach, no procedural unpredictability, no emotional charge in the handler's behavior, no agenda. Just a person eating breakfast in the same place at the same time every morning and sitting still afterward. She sent a message to the Calvin's Reach Depot, addressed to the behavioral observer on file. Pierre forwarded it to me. The message explained who she was, explained the significance of what the observation logs described, and asked, very politely, whether she could arrange a site visit. She also mentioned that the behavioral state Pierre had labeled ground calm had been cross-referenced against the wider Dreth behavioral literature, and had not been previously documented, which meant that if it could be reliably replicated and described, it would constitute a significant contribution to the field. I replied that she was welcome to visit, that the depot wasn't hard to find, and that she should plan for the coffee to be bad. She arrived 6 weeks later, which brings me to approximately month 5.5, and to the other thing that arrived around the same time. Torvith Nas arrived 11 days before Dr. Hallen. His designation was Depot Assessment Officer, Alliance Certification Division, and his role was to conduct a formal operational review of Calvin's Reach as part of a cycle of assessments of interim holding facilities throughout the system. He was in his mid-40s, wore a clean uniform, and carried the particular kind of confident administrative energy that comes from spending a career in a part of the organization that tells operational people what they can and cannot do. He had a deputy, a younger man named Cale, who wore an expression of professional neutrality and took notes on a secondary data pad. I met them at the depot entrance. Nas shook my hand, confirmed my credentials, and began his inspection of the facility. Pierre showed him the documentation office. I walked him around the perimeter of the pen. Nas studied the facility. He studied the pen. He reviewed the intake documentation on the Dreth. He reviewed the safety protocols, the ones my predecessor had laminated onto cards and I had put in the counter drawer. He reviewed Pierre's logs selectively, and then asked several questions about the handler certification for direct contact Dreth management, which was a specific Alliance certification that I did not hold because the certification was designed for training facilities, not interim depots, and the original posting requirements had not listed it. The intake documentation specifies Class C barrier gear for enclosure entry, Nas said. For handlers unfamiliar with the animals, I said. That's what the documentation says. I'm familiar with the animals. The certification requirement for direct contact management of Class 3 predatory species applies regardless of handler familiarity. Then we have different readings of the regulation. He had the regulation on his data pad. He showed me the relevant paragraph, which did, in fact, say what he said it said, and did not include the qualifier I had applied to it. I acknowledged this. He made a note. The following 2 days of his inspection covered the physical facility, the feeding systems, the documentation protocols, and the animal's transfer status. The receiving facility that had originally been designated for the cubs had withdrawn from the certification process 6 months prior, which meant that the Calvin's reach transfer was in administrative limbo. The cubs had no confirmed destination, which was part of why the posting was open-ended. Nas, reviewing the transfer records, concluded that the appropriate resolution was to identify a certified facility immediately and complete the transfer before the depot's interim certification lapsed. On the morning of the 3rd day of his visit, Nas told me he was going to conduct a direct observation of the animals. He said direct observation, and I understood he meant from outside the enclosure, at the observation mesh panel. I was preparing for the morning feeding. I had been taking over direct feeding 4 weeks earlier, replacing the remote arm system, which Pierre had documented as producing another significant shift in the cubs' arousal profiles during meal times. I nodded and told him to use the panel on the north face. What Nas actually did, and this I did not see until it was in progress because I was at the far end of the pen checking the water supply line, was open the east gate and walk into the enclosure. I heard the gate and turned around. Nas was inside the fence, Deputy Kale still outside it with the data pads. Nas had a field scanner, the kind used for biometric assessment of large animals, and he was advancing toward the shelter overhang where the cubs rested in the morning before feeding, with the intent, I assumed, of getting close enough to take readings. The 3 cubs were in the shelter. They had been resting. They were not resting now. All 3 had come to their feet. Their crests were at full raise, the maximum arousal position, the plates fanned to their widest extension, which on a juvenile Dreth the size of Orath was impressive in the specific sense of making the animal appear 30% larger than it was at rest. Their anterior limbs were shifted forward. Kale, who was nearest the gate side and had been lying closest to the approach path, had his head lowered into the combat-ready posture. Sunken Eye had risen from her resting position and was moving. Not running. Dreth don't run as a first tactical response. They move at a measured pace that only looks slow until you understand what it implies. She was moving toward the space between Nas and the cubs. I crossed the pen. Not running either. I walked at the pace I always walked, which was the even unhurried pace of someone who has been doing this for 19 years and understands that urgency in a handler is read as threat confirmation by the animals. I came up beside Nas and spoke quietly. "Stop moving," I said. Nas stopped. He was looking at the cubs. His expression was the expression of someone who had reviewed Class 3 predatory species as a category on a data pad and was now encountering the category in its physical form. "Back up 3 steps," I said. "Slowly, don't turn around." He backed up. The cub's crests remained raised. Sunken Eye had not stopped moving. She came to a position 2 meters in front of Nas and stopped there, and she did not lower her crest and she did not look away from him. And I want to be precise about this because the later accounts sometimes describe it as the pack matron charging or threatening physical contact. She did not do either of those things. She stood. She was very large. Her clouded eye was toward him, and her good eye was on him, and she was completely, absolutely, motionlessly still in the way that experienced predators are still. Not the stillness of hesitation, but the stillness of a thing that has made all the decisions it needs to make, and is waiting to see if the situation resolves itself before any of those decisions become actions. The three cubs had come out from under the shelter overhang. They were behind Sunken Eye and to either side, and they had also stopped, and they were also still. I walked past Nas and stood between him and Sunken Eye. I did not do this because it was the protocol-correct action. There was no protocol for this situation, because the protocol assumed you would not have a depot assessor in the enclosure unannounced. I did it because I was between them, and that was the relevant physical fact. I said quietly in the direction of the animals, "Easy." I said it in the tone I used when I said most things to them, which was the tone of not being alarmed, because I was not alarmed. I was tired and my knee hurt, and I had not yet had my breakfast, and the situation was inconvenient rather than dangerous, provided everyone continued to make reasonable decisions. Kale looked at me. His crest lowered. Veth looked at Kale, looked at me, and his crest lowered. Oreth kept his crest raised for another 3 seconds. Oreth always took the extra 3 seconds, and then it lowered. Sunken Eye did not lower her crest. She kept her eye on Nas, but she did not move. "Back up to the gate," I told Nas. "Don't turn around, just keep backing up." He backed up to the gate. Kale, the deputy, opened it from outside. Nas stepped through it. I heard the latch engage. I turned back to the pen. Sunken Eye was still watching the gate. The three cubs were behind her, crests lowered but not fully compressed. I walked back to my usual spot, picked up the camp stove and kit bag where I had set them down, and set the stove up and started breakfast. Kale came and sat on my feet before I'd finished the first component. I wrote up the incident that evening. Pierre had written it up in real time from the observation panel, and his version was more thorough and more distressed. Nas filed his own report, which I did not see until later, in which he described the animals as presenting a significant unprovoked threat display toward authorized inspection personnel, and recommended that the transfer be completed as an urgent matter, citing both the facility's certification gap and, now, a documented aggression incident. I read his report when it was forwarded to me 2 days later. I sat with it for a while. Then I wrote a response, which I tried to keep factual and short, and which said, among other things, that the display had been a predictable response to an unannounced entry by an unfamiliar individual, in a direction that the animals were conditioned to associate with feeding and handler approach, and that characterizing this as unprovoked required a definition of provocation that I did not think the certification division intended. I also noted, in a separate paragraph, that the pack matron had not initiated physical contact with Inspector Nas at any point, that the cubs had responded immediately to a calm handler vocal cue, and that the situation had resolved without injury in under 90 seconds from initial display to gate exit. I noted this because I thought it was the most important information in the incident from a behavioral standpoint. The animals had been able to modulate their response. They were not uncontrolled. They were protecting something. There is a meaningful difference between an animal that cannot stop itself and an animal that chooses not to, once it has received a signal from the thing it is protecting that the situation does not require the full weight of what it could do. Nas's report did not make this distinction. My response did. I do not know if anyone at the certification division read the distinction carefully. The file grew either way. Pierre, for his part, had written his own incident log with the kind of precision that I had come to appreciate. The timestamps, the behavioral state descriptors, the distance measurements. He had noted that Sunken Eye's defensive positioning had placed her between the inspector and the cubs at a point before the cubs had fully mobilized, which meant her assessment of the situation had preceded theirs, and her response had partly shaped theirs. She had made the call first. They had read her. He had also noted, because Pierre noted everything, that Kale had been the first to lower his crest after my vocal cue, and that Veth and Oreth had followed Kale rather than responding directly to me, which Peer characterized as secondary social transmission of handler-derived arousal modulation through pack hierarchy. I characterized it as Kale listening and the other two watching Kale, because that was what it looked like. Nas and Kale left the depot on the second day after the incident. Nas did not speak to me again before he left, which was fine. Kale gave me a nod in the corridor outside the staff quarters, the specific nod of someone who observed something and is not in a position to say anything about what they observed but wanted to acknowledge that they saw it. I gave him a nod back. Nas submitted his recommendations to the Alliance Certification Processing Center 3 days later. His report and my response both went into the file. It was 4 days before Dr. Hallen arrived. She was a small, precise woman in her 60s with close-cropped gray hair and the kind of hands that had spent a lot of time working with animals, specific calluses in specific places. She shook my hand at the depot entrance and then immediately asked to see the pen, not in the way of someone conducting an inspection, but in the way of someone who wanted to see something they had been reading about for 6 weeks. I took her around to the south face, and we stood at the observation panel. The cubs were in their morning rest position in the shelter. Sunkenai was in her sentinel resting position in the center of the open section, which by this point meant she was approximately 2 meters from where my chair sat unoccupied. Dr. Hallen looked at this for about 30 seconds without saying anything. "Is that the pack matron's primary resting position?" she asked. "For the last 8 weeks. She made a note. She looked at the chair. She looked at where the chair was relative to where Sunkenai was. She looked at the cubs. The behavioral observer's documentation describes the pack matron as originally resting at the far end of the enclosure," she said. "She was. And she migrated to here. Over about 3 weeks." Dr. Hallen looked at the pen for another moment, and then she said a word in what I think was Verath technical shorthand, very quietly, and made several more notes. I showed her Peer's complete documentation over the next 2 hours. She had read the filed portions already, but she went through the raw logs, which were considerably more detailed, with the attention of someone reading a primary source. She asked questions that were specific and good. Not how did you train them, but when did you first observe the reference check behavior during the freighter pass, and what was the lighting condition when Kale first made contact? She asked about my background in a matter-of-fact way, without the undertone of skepticism I was accustomed to, and I gave her a matter-of-fact answer. She asked at the end if I would be willing to demonstrate the morning routine the following day while she observed. I said I would. The following morning I set up the stove and made breakfast in the pen, in my usual spot, in my usual sequence, with my usual unhurried lack of ceremony. Dr. Hallen observed from the outside of the mesh panel. Peer observed from his documentation station. Neither of them entered the enclosure. Kale sat on my feet before I finished the first cup of coffee. He was there within 4 minutes of me sitting down, which was faster than usual. I thought at the time that it might be the additional observers affecting his behavior. But looking at the footage Peer recorded that morning, I think it was actually the opposite. The additional, still observers had made the pen feel more like a settled environment rather than less, because still observers register as established presences rather than novel threats. Veth and Oreth were at their usual positions by the time I finished eating. Sunkenai was in her sentinel position, 2 meters out, facing the perimeter. I sat for my 10 minutes. Nobody moved. Dr. Hallen was quiet for a long time after that. Then she said, from outside the mesh, in the specific tone of someone who has spent a career being careful with language and is choosing their words very deliberately, "What you have produced here, handler having, is the first stable social bond between juvenile Dreth and a non-Dreth handler that has been documented in a controlled observational setting in 40 years of study. The last documented instance was at a frontier post on Edvar's Range, under conditions that were never replicable because the handler died before the methodology could be assessed. I said, "All right." She said, "I want to be clear about the significance. The behavioral state your observer documented as ground calm is not merely a notable response pattern. It is the foundational precondition for Dreth pack integration with non-Dreth individuals. Without ground calm, a handler cannot be recognized as a pack affiliate. Without pack affiliation, training deployment with a non-Dreth handler is structurally impossible. Every attempt to establish Dreth training units with non-Dreth commanders has failed because we have never been able to reliably produce ground calm. You have produced it, in 3 subjects simultaneously, in a non-optimal holding environment, without any of the conditions the current literature holds to be necessary." I finished my coffee. I sat in the pen every morning. "Yes," she said, "you sat in the pen every morning." There was a pause. "The certification division has a transfer recommendation pending on these animals," I said. "I am aware of that," she said. "I have already sent a communication to the certification division. I sent it this morning, before I observed the routine. The communication is co-signed by the Dreth Behavioral Sciences Program Director and the Alliance Training Command's Animal Handling Specialist Office." She paused. "Inspector Naz's report characterizes the pack matron's response to his enclosure entry as an aggression incident. The communication to the certification division characterizes it as a protective response by a bonded adult toward a recognized pack affiliate, triggered by an unannounced entry by an unknown individual. These are meaningfully different classifications." I didn't say anything. "The transfer recommendation will not be action," she said. "The depot's certification status is being reviewed under a research protocol designation that suspends the standard lapse timeline. Handler having, if you are willing, we would like to extend your posting indefinitely for the purposes of the study, but practically until the juveniles reach adult certification age, at significantly revised compensation." I looked at the pen. Kale was still on my feet. Oreth had fallen asleep, which Dreth juveniles do sometimes during the post-meal sit. It was a sign of deep environmental comfort that always cost me something I could not name, seeing it. Veth was looking at a small stone that had turned up in the pen's surface near his forefoot, inspecting it with the focused stillness that meant he had found it interesting. Sunken Eye was watching the perimeter. "The coffee is still going to be bad," I said. "I will arrange for a supply line," she said. I told her I'd think about it. I thought about it for about 4 hours, which in my experience is the appropriate amount of time to take for decisions that are already made, but deserve the decency of not being made instantly. I extended the posting. What happened after that is documented in the Alliance Dreth Behavioral Sciences archive at Verath Station. In 2 years of peer, Aden's meticulous and increasingly excited observation logs, and in a monograph that Dr. of Hallen published in the following year that has since been, I'm told, required reading in every Alliance Handler certification program. I contributed a 6-paragraph section to the monograph at Dr. of Hallen's request, covering the initial approach methodology in my own words, which is to say covering the part about eating breakfast in the pen and sitting in the chair afterward. The section is 6 paragraphs long, and I was asked 3 times to expand it and declined each time, because there was not more to say. Ground calm became the formal term, not just Peer's provisional notation label, but the official designation in the Alliance's Dreth behavioral taxonomy, the name for the foundational state that all subsequent handler training protocols were built around. The methodology for producing it, which is described in the certification training materials in careful, systematic language that fills 37 pages, is, at its irreducible core, do the same thing in the same place at the same time, with no agenda and no fear, until the animal decides you are a stable feature of its world. Do that long enough and it will put you in its pack. Everything else is commentary. Nas filed 2 more communications with the certification division over the following months, both of which were processed and closed without action. I know this because Pierre, who was genuinely delighted by the paperwork outcomes in a way that I found disproportionate but also endearing, printed out the processing confirmations and put them on the documentation office wall. I did not ask him to take them down. The transfer recommendation for the cubs was formally withdrawn 8 months after my extension began, upon the cubs reaching the developmental threshold at which the receiving facility question became moot. They were old enough to be assessed for the formal alliance handler bond protocols, which were now going to be built around the ground calm baseline that they themselves had produced, and which required them to remain at Calvin's reach for the duration of the assessment process, which was, practically speaking, the remainder of their juvenile period. By the time all of this was settled, Kale was the size of a medium freight hauler. Orath was larger. Veth was precisely as large as Veth needed to be and not an inch more, which was Veth's consistent position on everything. Sunken Eye's clouded eye did not improve with age. Her crest lowered permanently in the 2nd year, not to the compressed, flattened position of threat suppression, but to the easy, mid-set resting position of an animal that has decided the environment does not require full arousal most of the time. She moved more slowly. She rested more. Her sentinel position shifted so that she was closer to the chair, from 2 meters to approximately 1 meter over time, and she did not move away from it when the cubs came to do their morning sit. She became, in the documentation, a stable background presence, the elder anchor who had watched the whole thing from the first day and had made her assessment in the earliest weeks and had simply continued making it, correctly, ever since. I broke my wrist in the 14th month when I caught my foot on the edge of the stove setup kit in the dark, 5:30 in the morning before the sunrise routine, and went down on the compacted earth with enough force to hear the snap. I sat up and assessed the damage and decided it was a clean fracture and could wait for the morning routine to be finished before I dealt with it. I set up the stove one-handed. It took longer than usual. All 3 cubs were at their positions before I finished the first component. Kale was on my feet before the water boiled. I ate breakfast one-handed and did not make a thing of the wrist, and nobody in the pen made a thing of the wrist. And then I went and had Pierre look at it and drive me to the depot's medical unit on the other side of the station, where a medic who had clearly seen a great many frontier workers put a scan on it and said, "Clean fracture, 2 weeks," and gave me a brace. The brace did not fit through the sleeve of the jacket I wore in the pen at that hour of the morning. I wore the brace for 3 days and then left it off and wore the splint instead, which fit. Pierre made a note about the wrist in the log, and Dr. Avhallen, reviewing remotely, sent a message asking whether the injury had affected the cub's morning behavior. I told her Kale had sat on my feet, Veth had taken his position, Orath had spent the supervisory sit watching the brace with his intense focus crest compression, and Sunken Eye had continued her perimeter watch. She wrote back a single line, "Of course." I read that message a couple of times. Then I put the handheld in my jacket pocket and went back to the pen. On the morning after the certification division closed Nas's final communication, I brought my usual breakfast out to the pen as I always did: camp stove, field ration, metal bowl and cup. I set up the stove. I made the food. I sat in the chair and ate it. Kale was on my feet before I finished my coffee. Orath was to my right in his supervisory position, crest at the focus compression, watching the morning sequence with the same attention he had brought to it in the 3rd week, when everything was still new. Veth was to my left in his rest crouch, and had found another small stone to look at. Sunken Eye was in her resting position 1 meter from the chair, facing outward, watching the perimeter the way she always did. The freight haulers came down the approach path at 6:45, as they often did, and the sound moved through the pen as it always did, and the cubs looked at me as they had learned to do, and I was not startled because I was never startled by freight haulers, and after a moment they settled back into their positions. I finished my breakfast. I put the bowl on the ground as I always did. I sat for my 10 minutes. Kale adjusted his weight on my feet. He was considerably heavier now than he had been when he first sat there, in the way that apex predators are heavier than they look even as juveniles. And in 6 months, he would be heavy enough that I was genuinely going to have to address the foot sitting as a practical matter. And I had been thinking about how to address it without disrupting the routine, and had arrived at the conclusion that I would probably just get a second chair and put it next to mine and see what he did with it. Not as a training intervention, just as a practical solution to the foot-sitting problem, in the same spirit that the first chair had been a practical solution to the knee problem. That was the whole of it. The morning routine, the same food, the same chair, the same 10 minutes after, the freight haulers, the perimeter watch, the small stones that Dreth found interesting. The Dreth have a word for it now, apparently. Not ground calm, that's the Alliance's word, the classification term. The Dreth word is older. Dr. Avhallen sent me a translation of it when she wrote to tell me about the monograph citations. It means something close to the stillness of a thing that was always here. She said the biologists in her department had been surprised to find that the concept existed in Dreth vocabulary at all, since the existing literature held that Dreth pack bonds with non-Dreth individuals were essentially undocumented. I thought about that for a while too. Then I went and made coffee, which was still bad, and brought it out to the pen. Kale was already sitting on my feet.